I was carefully unwrapping our wedding porcelain, pieces we'd selected during happier times, when a man's unfamiliar voice delivered the sort of revelation that fundamentally shatters the architecture of a marriage. "I witnessed something you need to see," he said quietly. "Your husband, his mother, they were together." The instruction that followed felt like ice water in my veins. "Don't involve your spouse. Come by yourself." I remained motionless, a delicate teacup suspended in my trembling fingers, as I observed the two individuals I'd constructed my entire world around, seated in my sitting room, their laughter carrying that distinctive quality of intimacy born from shared secrets. In that crystalline moment of clarity, I recognized with devastating certainty that the future I had meticulously envisioned might have already crumbled into dust. My name is Catherine Marshall, and precisely 7 days before that jarring telephone call, my husband David and I had finalized the acquisition of what we genuinely believed would be our sanctuary, a gracious 3-story Victorian residence featuring original cornicing, sprawling gardens, and architectural bones that promised permanence. I had personally funded the substantial majority of this purchase through inheritance gifted to me by my father, a dedicated secondary school educator whose 30-year career had never accumulated significant material wealth. Yet he'd bequeathed me something far more valuable: sufficient resources to transform a lifetime of modest existence into something tangible and enduring. When I executed those closing documents, I felt certain my father would have observed with quiet satisfaction. At 40 years of age, I genuinely believed I had finally constructed something that would remain, something permanent, something mine. The telephone rang during a Tuesday afternoon when our residence still bore the temporary appearance of active relocation, cardboard containers arranged haphazardly, the distinct aroma of newly applied paint lingering everywhere. A number I didn't recognize appeared on my mobile, and I nearly dismissed it entirely. Something ineffable compelled me to respond. "Ms. Marshall, this is Edmund Price. I handled the sale of your property." His identity returned immediately to memory. A gentleman in his 70s, characterized by a measured demeanor, formerly employed as a consulting engineer, possessed of surprisingly gentle features and hands that trembled slightly during our introduction at the settlement table. He'd resided within that house for 32 years alongside his wife, before her passing, and when presenting the keys to me, he'd expressed hope that the residence would offer us comparable contentment to what it had offered them. "Is everything satisfactory, Mr. Price?" A peculiar anxiety began to coalesce within my chest, though I couldn't articulate precisely why. A prolonged silence suggested the connection might have failed. Finally, his voice resumed, noticeably strained. "I must confess something regrettable. During the installation of our automation infrastructure years previous, we positioned a surveillance device within the main reception area. Before the transaction completed, I deactivated the majority of these systems, though evidently I overlooked one. It remains connected to my cloud storage account. Only recently did I discover it was still operational. The system transmitted a notification regarding storage capacity. When I accessed the footage to perform deletion, I observed something you genuinely require to witness yourself." His voice became even more measured, almost defensive. "I'd rather maintain this conversation in person. I've preserved the recordings to a portable drive. Could you visit me, absolutely alone? Please withhold this information from your husband initially." His emphasis on discretion sent my stomach plummeting. "What precisely would I be viewing?" I managed to ask. "It's not something I can adequately describe over the telephone," he responded, his tone adopting an almost protective quality. "Please visit privately." I consented, concluding our discussion before curiosity could transform into interrogation, because my hands had begun exhibiting visible trembling, and I desperately wished to conceal this physical manifestation from Mr. Price's observation. I disconnected the call and positioned my mobile on the kitchen counter, subsequently gazing through the adjacent threshold toward the sitting room where David was positioned upon a stepladder, suspending a framed photograph depicting his progenitor's wedding celebration. His mother, Margaret, was orchestrating the arrangement with the characteristic authority possessed by someone perpetually assured of her own judgment's infallibility. "Adjust it somewhat leftward," she commanded, her voice carrying that particular combination of warmth and steely resolve I'd recognized throughout our entire relationship. David executed her directive without resistance, demonstrating the characteristic compliance he continually exhibited toward her, a tendency I'd previously interpreted as devotional loyalty, though now I questioned everything. They exchanged laughter regarding some reference I hadn't registered, and I observed their expressions intently, searching for any telltale indicator of deception. I discovered nothing suspicious in their features. David rotated, meeting my gaze, and delivered his customary smile, the identical expression that had captivated me 12 years previous when my father had recently passed away, and this man had seemed to materialize at precisely those moments when I required his presence most. "You appear unwell," he observed with apparent concern. "I'm managing satisfactorily," I replied, constructing a falsehood so effortlessly it actually frightened me somewhat. "I'm experiencing fatigue. I'm considering going out briefly. We're apparently running low on wall covering for the secondary bedroom." The deception emerged without hesitation, smoothly executed, which itself constituted a troubling development. Margaret's attention lingered upon me momentarily, her eyes executing that particular examination she frequently employed, as though perpetually assessing me against some interior measuring device, some benchmark of acceptability I would eternally fail to satisfy. "Take whatever time you require, dear," she replied with that saccharine gentleness that somehow managed to feel patronizing. "We'll attend to matters here." I retrieved my automotive keys and personal accessories, navigating toward my vehicle with my cardiovascular system executing in frantic rhythm against my ribs. Before commencing the engine, I remained immobilized behind the steering apparatus for roughly 60 seconds, breathing deliberately, rehearsing reassurances to myself. Undoubtedly, this represented some misunderstanding. Certainly, David and Margaret had simply been engaged in some ordinary household undertaking, furniture repositioning, window dressing evaluation, something entirely unremarkable. Simultaneously, I comprehended with a deeper, intuitive awareness that I'd suspected something amiss for considerable time. The minor hesitations, the particular manner in which David deflected certain inquiries, Margaret's insistence upon attending the final property inspection, the way both had become progressively settled in our residence, almost proprietorial, as though mentally redesigning spaces they possessed no legitimate claim to redesign. I reversed from the driveway and examined my residence through the rearview mirror one final time, that structure radiating golden luminescence in the declining afternoon illumination, representing precisely the existence I had constructed for myself. I remained unconscious that I was, in fact, driving directly toward the occurrence that would systematically dismantle my matrimonial existence. Edmund Price's recent residence constituted a modest suburban property, the sort of location that belongs to someone who has maintained meticulous intentionality throughout an entire lifetime. He opened the entrance prior to my arrival at the threshold, as though he'd been monitoring for my vehicle's approach. His countenance communicated what I most feared. This would constitute no innocent clarification. "Thank you for coming," he said, permitting me entry. "I harbored genuine uncertainty regarding whether you would." "You presented it with considerable gravity," I observed. "It genuinely is." He guided me toward a compact kitchen table where a computing device rested, its monitor dark, anticipating what would follow. I seated myself, observing my extremities had turned remarkably frigid despite the comfortable ambient temperature. Edmund lowered himself into the adjacent chair with the deliberate movements characteristic of someone whose joints had deteriorated through advancing age, maintaining silence momentarily prior to continuing his explanation. "I must establish something essential," he commenced. "I'm not someone who circulates seeking involvement in others' private matters. I assembled that surveillance infrastructure personally, predominantly for my wife's reassurance when I conducted professional travels. Throughout the real estate transaction, I deactivated every camera I could recollect. I overlooked this particular unit, positioned behind the literature shelving, connected via an outlet I'd genuinely forgotten about. Only when my cloud service indicated storage had exceeded capacity did I discover it remained operational." He paused meaningfully. I accessed the recordings for deletion purposes, subsequently observed the content, and recognized I bore responsibility for revealing what I'd witnessed before destroying evidence. "Display it," I requested, my capacity for hesitation entirely depleted. He repositioned the computing device toward me and initiate. D-playback. The footage originated from 4 days prior, a Friday afternoon when I'd been completing professional obligations that had detained me until evening. The perspective was elevated, overlooking our sitting room, my residence, still containing unopened storage containers arranged along the perimeter. I observed David permit himself entry via the front portal, subsequently Margaret appearing. Her expression exhibiting that particular assessment, one, demonstrates when mentally possessing something. My physiology involuntarily inclined forward, as though proximity to the screen might somehow alter what I was about to experience. She still maintains the conviction this residence is collectively owned. Margaret's voice emerged through the speaker system, settling upon the furniture's edge, her voice possessing that distinctive amalgamation of affection and intimidation I'd endured throughout my marriage. "She completely believes me," David answered, his familiar laughter emerging, the identical amusement I'd fallen hopelessly in love with 12 years prior. "Why would she scrutinize documentation? I represent her spouse." "That confidence represents a considerable asset," Margaret responded, "provided we exercise it appropriately." I perceived the temperature within my chest descending, transforming into something immobilized, something possessing no designation yet. They sustained their discourse. Margaret mentioned refinancing particulars. She'd apparently initiated consultations with a mortgage professional she possessed personal relationships with, someone purportedly disinclined to pose excessively rigorous inquiries. David mentioned my inherited contribution represented approximately 70% of the preliminary financial commitment, and Margaret responded that such resources ought to have traversed appropriate familial channels, that it should have possessed superior structural arrangement from inception. They examined paperwork. A power of authority provision apparently concealed somewhere amongst a substantial documentation collection would facilitate ownership alteration gradually, discreetly, legitimately, without requiring dramatic confrontation ever materializing. Margaret articulated, over time, repeatedly, savoring the terminology as though consuming something requiring considerable temporal investment to achieve appropriate completion. "She won't comprehend," David declared. "She never detects these circumstances. She places complete confidence in me with everything." I remained absolutely motionless at Edmund's kitchen table, observing my spouse characterize my affection as a resource to be controlled, and I encountered understanding so visceral it felt nearly physiological. The individual cradling my hand throughout my father's interment, and this individual occupying that recorded display, somehow represented an identical individual, which seemed fundamentally inconceivable. The recording persisted for an additional 6 minutes. I absorbed every moment. I observed Margaret navigate my kitchen, opening cupboards, pronouncing that the arrangement would accommodate entertaining more effectively once particular architectural elements underwent removal. I observed David nodding along to everything, compliant in that particular manner he continuously demonstrated regarding his mother. A lifelong inheritance I'd previously interpreted as admirable attachment. Now I comprehended it signified something entirely different. Submission, perhaps, or something resembling collusion. When the footage concluded, Edmund closed the computing apparatus gently, almost reverently, as though excessive velocity might compound my expanding distress. "I've replicated everything to a portable drive," he articulated, positioning a miniature USB apparatus across the table. Every perspective, every timestamp, comprehensive documentation of everything the device observed. "I don't comprehend what's transpiring within your matrimonial circumstances, Ms. Marshall, and providing speculation remains beyond my purview. However, residences maintain accountability to nothing excepting what's independently verified. I determined you ought to possess this documentation prior to anyone deciding to eliminate what genuinely transpired." I captured the apparatus and maintained it within my palm. Diminutive, lightweight, bearing barely the substance of a residence key, yet somehow seeming capable of destabilizing my existence's fundamental architecture. I appreciate this, I articulated, my articulation emerging more fortified than I anticipated. I'm uncertain how to repay this generosity. You possess no obligation, he replied. I liquidated that residence because my spouse and I constructed a genuine home there, and I would harbor regret contemplating someone forfeiting an equivalent opportunity through dishonesty. He accompanied me toward the exit, and before I departed into the fading atmospheric condi, Tians, he communicated something additional, quietly, almost resembling caution. You maintain opportunity, Ms. Marshall. Regardless of your eventual decision, you maintain opportunity for appropriate action. I navigated homeward with the apparatus secured within my outer garment, my appendage positioned protectively over it at every traffic control apparatus, as though relaxing my grip might permit it to dematerialize. Somewhere throughout that quiet route back toward the residence my inherited funds had financed, I reached a determination. I wouldn't confront them instantaneously. Not preceding comprehensive comprehension of the conspiracy's scope, not preceding my capacity to guarantee its inability to recur against me or anything I treasured. I penetrated my residence that evening and underwent transformation into a different iteration of myself. Not fundamentally altered, precisely, merely a more subdued version, someone who discovered during a solitary afternoon that the most secure location for particular knowledge remains, concealed behind psychological boundaries, one maintains internally. How was the decorative supply merchant? David inquired, insufficiently attentive to observe my entrance, instead occupied with unpacking kitchen implements. Congested, I dissembled. I'll return tomorrow when conditions prove quieter. He acknowledged this with satisfaction, that constituting our entire exchange. I recollect positioning myself within the aperture momentarily, observing him arrange our cutlery into the compartmentalized container I'd procured weeks prior with such uncomplicated contentment, and perceiving something unusual crystallize surrounding me. Not fury, not instantaneously, but a particular frigid perspicacity resembling stepping into external conditions on winter's initial morning, finally observing your own respiratory exhalation. Throughout the successive days, I executed something I'd never performed during our 12-year relationship. I commenced examining my spouse through the observation techniques one applies to unfamiliar individuals. I detected elements I'd continuously perceived, yet never genuinely examined. David addressed every financial communication arriving through our postal service with practiced proficiency I'd previously respected. He characterized it, simply more straightforward this manner, whenever I volunteered assistance. I noticed Margaret, frequenting approximately every other day ostensibly to facilitate our establishment, perpetually positioned herself as mail collections executor, retrieving our correspondence prior to my workplace departure. I detected their conversational patterns shifting when I materialized in proximity, not terminating precisely, but transforming, rerouting similar to water discovering alternate trajectories surrounding an obstruction. Individually, nothing communicated anything significant. Collectively, everything conveyed consequence. 3 days subsequent to my Edmund Price consultation, David presented himself with a communication portfolio and arranged it across our eating surface exhibiting that particular untroubled demeanor suggesting he was discussing recreational activities. Refinancing documentation, he announced. Merely optimizing several loan components subsequent to closing, unremarkable administrative work. Margaret, coincidentally present, she perpetually seemed coincidentally present, extended her appendage across my wrist with a reassuring contact. Everyone addresses this afterward, dear. Fundamentally tedious, yet merely paperwork. You authenticate a few pages and completion occurs. I examined the portfolio, dense and legitimate appearing, and experienced that particular frigid perspicacity transforming into something considerably more functional. A methodology. Obviously, I expressed with performed enthusiasm. Allow me examination when I possess uninterrupted temporal availability. I genuinely appreciate reviewing matters before authenticating. You appreciate how meticulous I am. David's jaw constricted momentarily, so briefly I might have imagined it absent my intensified attention. Obviously, he responded. Nothing pressing. Yet something permeated the atmosphere between them, something resembling tension, resembling urgency contained beneath superficial composure. I formulated queries throughout subsequent evenings. What does this terminology reference? Why does this particular section possess highlighting? Represents this the documented form the financial institution supplies? David addressed everything smoothly, confidently, demonstrating obvious relief that I wasn't demonstrating resistance. His underlying tension progressively dissipated. He underwent relaxation. He underwent transformation into someone I believe genuinely anticipated my supposed gullibility. My mother-in-law's characterization of me apparently validated completely in his perspective. What he overlooked, subsequent to his slumber each evening, I positioned myself at the kitchen table, beneath fluorescent illumination, navigating through every portfolio page methodically. I photographed every document via my mobile apparatus prior to reinstating the portfolio to its precise placement. I established a fresh electronic mail account utilizing a designation meaning nothing to anyone except myself, initiating forwarding of documentation copies accompanied by photographs, screen captures, and timestamps. I positioned a miniature vocal recording device within my cardigan pocket throughout family dining experiences, subsequently replaying these exchanges privately within my automotive vehicle, positioned 3 geographical subdivisions from my workplace, where nobody I acknowledged would observe me experiencing private emotional collapse prior to commencing my professional responsibilities with composed presentation. I constructed my corresponding documentation archive, a concealed repository expanding substantially each subsequent interval with verification of precisely what I'd encountered on Edmund's recording apparatus. It was throughout the 5th evening, navigating by diminutive illumination whilst Jonathan remained dormant, that I encountered the specific terminology that altered everything fundamentally. Concealed upon documentation, page 14, presented in language so deliberately complex it appeared specifically engineered for disregard, existed a provision allocating David's circumscribed power of attorney authority regarding residential matters, capable of activation, subsequent to my authentication and notarized formalization. The terminology maintained careful construction, nearly eloquent, characterized as administrative convenience, something producing streamlined future paperwork so I would escape burdensome administrative obligations. It fundamentally wasn't simply refinancing. It constituted refinancing encasing something fundamentally different entirely. A juridical apparatus that, once operated, would permit David authoritative determination regarding my residence, my paternal inheritance, my existence, without necessitating further consultation. I remained profoundly motionless throughout my residence's darkness, hearing its unfamiliar creaking, still strange, following merely 7 residential days, contemplating my educator father, reflecting upon his meticulous methodology throughout his financial existence, recalling how he'd consistently articulated that losing something valuable fundamentally isn't accomplished via thievery. It's accomplished via confidence, extended toward incorrect individuals without verification of where it ultimately concludes. I closed the computational apparatus, and for the inaugural occasion subsequent to Edmund's communication, I permitted myself something approximating a restrained smile transmitted through darkness. They anticipated my capitulation toward my existence's liquidation. I was implementing mechanisms guaranteeing my future remained permanently secured. I encountered attorney Michael Torres, credentials the methodology most individuals locate professional representatives when they harbor hesitation requesting guidance from individuals they personally recognized. A late evening technological inquiry executed from my sleeping quarters with illumination intensity minimized so my spouse's unconscious presence wouldn't detect my exploration. Property law professional. 28 years of professional experience. Evaluations incorporating terminology like discrete, comprehensive. I initiated his workplace contact at my automotive vehicle's location the subsequent morning. My cardiac apparatus executed percussion, resembling wrongdoing rather than necessity, and I requested earliest appointment availability, not necessitating receptionist interrogation. Michael Torr's establishment occupied modest, unassuming location, situated above a clothing maintenance establishment throughout a quiet avenue, and I appreciated him instantaneously for exactly that reasoning. Nothing about his presence demonstrated interest in my impression. He potentially represented 58 years old, possessing gray Templar pigmentation, manifesting the unhurried character of someone who'd encountered every iteration of the narrative I was about to communicate, and experienced cessation of emotional reaction to such circumstances years previous. I transported everything: the USB apparatus, my documentary photographs, electronic communication reproductions, vocal recording samples, which I'd arranged chronologically through my mobile apparatus. I positioned it throughout his working surface, resembling evidence presentation at juridical proceedings, because, essentially, something resembling that constituted what I was performing. He examined the recording, initially in comprehensive silence, his expression remaining unreadable, periodically suspending proceedings for notation on his legal documentation in handry. Ting insufficiently legible for my reversed examination. When footage concluded, he repositioned his chair and examined me momentarily prior to articulation. Ms. Marshall, I maintain dedication toward directness because I determine you'd appreciate authenticity above compassionate minimization. Please. This constitutes nothing resembling fundamental refinancing documentation. That authority provision, positioned throughout page 14, upon authentication and notarized formalization, would allocate your spouse comprehensive authority concerning residential choices. Not instantaneous absolute possession, yet adequate framework permitting graduated property ownership alteration, borrowed funds elevation against accumulated property value, or property liquidation, everything without requiring your engaged participation throughout individual phases. It's engineered to appear unremarkable. It's engineered for authentication by someone who maintains confidence toward the individual presenting it without examining preliminary composition. I experienced my extremities constricting within my lap, therefore it's lawful. Superficially, absolutely, which constitutes what demonstrates hazardous. Fundamentally, nothing constitutes illegality regarding matrimonial partners requesting additional partners for authentication. Legislation customarily presumes if you authenticated something, you comprehended it, which indicates your genuine protection remains authentication refusal, and verifying they cannot quietly pressure additional situations. Can they? Not whenever we execute actions immediately. He positioned his composition apparatus against the notepad. I can formalize protective documentation today. A recorded notice, modernized property documentation, and thorough recording establishing you as the singular authority capable of verifying whatever property transfer or encumbrance. It fundamentally won't restrict them from requesting authentication. Yet it indicates whatever transfer, even supposing you authenticated circumstances without complete comprehension or beneath coercion, necessitates your physically confirmed presence and autonomous juridical consultation prior to finalization. Straightforwardly, I'm establishing a protective barrier surrounding your residence that exclusively you can operate. Alleviation moved through me with such immediacy it nearly created vertigo. Nevertheless, something more rigid developed underneath. Something that possessed been expanding subsequent to initially examining that documentation via laptop luminescence. I wanted additional than mere protective framework. I wanted them comprehending specifically what they'd attempted to perform. I wanted it documented. I wanted it indisputable. He examined me momentarily, and something shifted throughout his expression. Not quite astonishment, yet something resembling peaceful professional admiration. Then we implement this carefully. You sustain precisely your present path, refuse nothing, avoid confrontation, permit them imagining their approaching finalization regarding their objectives. Whenever someone's progressively comfortable, they progressively articulate. Whenever someone articulates further, your placement strengthens substantially. Simultaneously, I authenticate everything required, guaranteeing that regardless of what materializes throughout that collection, nothing genuinely transfers absent traversing my physical examination first. I departed his workplace that afternoon possessing documentation duplicates of everything he'd committed to submitting that temporal cycle, and I navigated homeward, internalizing carefully the character I required, maintaining persistent performance. Appreciative consort, trusting consort, someone progressively acquiescing to legitimately liquidating a life she didn't yet comprehend, was already lawfully shielded against them. It performed considerably superior to I'd anticipated. Throughout merely 2 days, David's manner shifted from cautious to contented. That jaw constriction I'd noticed, entirely eliminated. He underwent transformation into someone progressively communicating more transparently throughout dining experiences, mentioning offhand that potentially subsequent to administrative matters underwent completion. He'd lastly procure quotations regarding that home workspace he'd perpetually desired established within the foundation level. Margaret, perceiving triumph, the manner she appeared perceiving everything, commenced presenting with decorative swatches and furniture references, positioning them throughout my architectural surfaces with the proprietary confidence of someone mentally decorating something already conceived as legitimately hers. I observed them manufacturing their confidence resembling residential cards, individual relaxed dialogue, progressively reinforcing the conviction that they'd ultimately succeeded. I maintained comprehensive silence, disturbing nothing. Throughout Thursday evening, Margaret mentioned with calculated casualness that she possessed connection to a notarization professional capable of attending our residence directly. Substantially less complicated than automotive transportation, dear, particularly considering how engaged you've been. I permitted appropriate uncertainty duration to elapse, the hesitation someone might demonstrate when permitting go of something she'd been maintaining firmly. Subsequently, I responded positively. Monday, I articulated. We'll implement Monday. I'll possess the comprehensive weekend experiencing settled regarding it. Margaret's expression illuminated, resembling something approximate victory. David extended across and compressed my appendage, and I permitted him. I maintained composure, and I responded positively to him with deceptive simplicity that would genuinely terrify me previously because I comprehended, observing his reassured, gratified expression, that I'd transformed into someone entirely different than the individual blocking his intentions. I'd metamorphosed into someone, progressively, fastening the apparatus surrounding his conspiracy. The interval separating Thursday from Monday protracted peculiarly, extended skinny by tension exclusively, I seemed to perceive. Throughout our residence, circumstances demonstrated happiness's appearance. David vocalized harmonic melodies throughout breakfast creation. Margaret materialized practically daily, her measuring apparatus perpetually prepared, articulating incessantly regarding sectional positioning subsequent to we'd established this space somewhat, as though the residential components themselves already belonged to a future she'd already determined. I facilitated them articulating. I facilitated them arranging. I positioned courteous inquiries regarding square measurement. I demonstrated polite curiosity regarding decorative selections, and throughout my cardigan pocket, a diminutive vocal recording apparatus persisted accumulating proof of precisely what they'd verbally communicated. Throughout Friday evening, David commenced discourse regarding architectural modifications with frankness he'd never demonstrated throughout our relationship. He desired elimination of the architectural separation between my kitchen and eating area. He wanted basement workspace development, potentially something resembling a beverage maintenance installation for entertaining his college-era affiliates, individuals who still employed the designation he'd possessed at 22 years old. He articulated all of it with that peculiar, relaxed certainty of someone discussing a residence he'd mentally liquidated his joint ownership regarding, imagining me existing as pleasant, compliant background in his existence's periphery. We could potentially investigate acquiring something upstate eventually, he announced, consuming his beverage, subsequent to matters undergo more adaptability concerning finances. Adaptable the manner? I questioned, maintaining my vocal presentation light, fascinated, genuinely the expression of someone imagining she was merely collaborating throughout the experience. Oh, fundamentally, subsequent to documentation gets concluded, there's elevated flexibility facilitating choices, refinancing additional occasions down the timeline, potentially extracting several accumulated property appreciation toward investment endeavors. Fundamentally, something warranting your concern. He delivered a smile throughout his consumption apparatus, and I responded with equivalent positivity, and I contemplated Edmund's residential camera, positioned behind literary shelving, persisting in capturing everything, perpetually quietly communicating authenticity whenever everybody else inside the apartment wanted it dismissed. Saturday transported Margaret in complete manifestation, maneuvering throughout my kitchen with confidence that had terminated pretending toward guest-resembling courtesy. She accessed my food storage and repositioned dual compartments concerning improved orchestration. She positioned herself inside the primary residential space, appendages upon hips, and articulated toward David that my fireplace facing required substitute installation. Something demonstrating genuine personality, not this developer-grade mediocrity. The terminology you'd utilize regarding something you currently possessed completely, not something preserved inside another female's designation. It was Sunday evening, the occasion preceding the documented authentication, that I discovered the remaining documentary proof I hadn't even comprehended I remained searching toward capture. David positioned himself behind me whilst I was executing final food meal washing, the gesture so recognizable, so achingly unremarkable, that for one unprotected second, I genuinely overlooked everything I'd discovered regarding him. He positioned his appendages, surrounding my middle and articula. Ted against my scalp, transmitting affection to someone he imagined was somebody who positioned complete confidence in him, someone he believed he was demonstrating attention toward. Truly, he was capturing in that moment, unaware his compact recording apparatus preserved every articulation. Subsequent to everything's transferred, he articulated, his expression warm, his articulation low, certain he was articulating solely toward me, imagining he was presenting attention. You fundamentally won't even require examining any of this anymore. You'll basically awaken eventually and everything will undergo completion. You fundamentally won't even comprehend how it materialized. That's the comprehensive objective. I wanted to protect you away from experiencing any of this particular tension. I sustained my appendages transferring via the cleansing liquids, sustained my respiratory pattern regular, and somewhere throughout my cardigan pocket that diminutive recorder preserved every expression. That complete acknowledgement communicated by someone so convinced regarding his victory that he'd eliminated any reluctance. That communicates pleasant, I articulated, and I intended it resembling gratified, appreciative, the articulation of someone experiencing attention. Simply I comprehended what those terminology actually indicated. A completed mission communicated by someone envisioning himself triumphing sufficiently to discard self-control. Monday morning, I encountered Michael Torres yet again prior to employment at a beverage establishment's parking area, positioned geographical regions, separated from wherever we both maintained recognized existence. He validated that every submission had completed, that protective notification had been recorded, that possession documentation had undergone modernization, that all defensive materials assembled and prepared to exhibit whenever necessary. He examined me with equivalent peaceful professional admiration he demonstrated since our preliminary consultation. "Are you prepared regarding this evening?" he questioned. "I've been prepared," I articulated, subsequent to the moment I examined that video. That evening, I arrived to discover David establishing our eating surface with unusual intention, the highest quality porcelain, candles we'd obtained as matrimonial gifts and never previously utilized, a beverage selection he'd obviously selected deliberately for the circumstance. Margaret materialized eventually, presenting as though positioned for something requiring commemoration, her smile comprehensive and contented. Preliminary dining, prior to the documented authentication, David articulated, moving my sitting area prepared for me, We imagined you warranted something pleasant considering everything you've been remarkably comprehending regarding. I positioned myself throughout the sitting surface, opposite the dual individuals who'd invested temporal cycles scheming to acquire my residence, and I underwent relaxation, and I elevated my beverage container when David lifted his in commendation. "Toward fresh commencements," he pronounced, his expression offering warmth, his articulation saturated with someone's happiness anticipating his impending triumph. "Toward fresh commencements," I echoed, and I genuinely intended something fundamentally different by it than he did. Margaret delivered something resembling radiant expression, already mentally decorating something that would ultimately never legitimately belong to her, and neither of them acknowledged me repeatedly examining the front entrance, calculating duration. Comprehending that somewhere traversing toward our residence a vehicle was already maneuvering nearer carrying someone who would appear prior to our dining experience conclusion, and transform everything they'd currently imagined they'd genuinely already triumphed in acquiring. Dining unfolded precisely how David had orchestrated it. Fluorescent illumination flickering throughout my commemorative porcelain, beverage dispensed progressively generously, Margaret articulating something extensive regarding David's juvenile period that was supposed to, I imagine, reminding me how profoundly he belonged inside this familial network, how obviously I ought to desire belonging similarly. I participated with appropriate timing, I positioned suitable inquiries, I ingested insufficiently because my abdominal region had persisted tight with anticipation throughout the complete temporal period, yet nobody appeared to comprehend, excessively consumed with their particular quiet commemoration regarding implementing their scheme. When my eating implement underwent collection, David positioned his appendage interior to the furnishing compartment and obtained the authenticated paperwork, positioning it atop the eating surface amongst us with something approximating reverence. He opened it toward the concluding authentication location, smoothing it level utilizing his appendage, and transmitted the composition implement throughout the textile surface toward me. "Nothing urgent," he pronounced, yet his vision communicated something additional. "Whenever you're prepared." Margaret positioned herself marginally forward, her beverage container temporarily disregarded, observing the composition implement the manner someone watches something preceding seconds, preceding something resembling explosive energy. I secured it. I permitted my appendages to continue versus it momentarily, experiencing its substance, experiencing the substance of everything the preceding 2 temporal cycles had necessitated from me. The comprehensive quietude I'd sustained, the misrepresentations I'd performed, the periodic intervals I'd inhabited slumberless intervals possessing a recording apparatus inside my clothing, and something resembling destruction inside my thoracic area, with regards to what I'd discover he'd converted himself into. I directed the composition implement toward the authenticated location. The main entrance's notification apparatus vocalized. David's anterior region constricted with something resembling annoyance. "We're not anticipating anybody," he articulated, progressively toward himself compared to me, and he examined his maternal figure, who decreased her anterior portions marginally, equally perplexed. "I'll examine," I articulated, and I positioned the composition implement down without authenticating anything. I extended the main entrance to encounter Michael Torres, positioned throughout the residential premise employing his outer, covering appropriately fitted, unhurried and untroubled, juridical documentation positioned underneath his anterior section. Behind him, positioned somewhat retreated, remained someone employing residential apparel signifying registered governmental function, maintaining subsidiary documentation. "Favorable evening, Ms. Marshall," Michael articulated, his vocal rhythm calibrated precisely toward the moment, professional, disturbing, absolutely devoid of theatrical element, which remarkably permitted it to land substantially more powerful compared to if he'd existed communicating something resembling aggressive intensity. I determined this constitutes an optimal temporal interval. I displaced myself and permitted them inner ward. David underwent displacement from the sitting surface with surprising velocity, his positioning executing something resembling irritation. "What's transpiring?" His optical centers maneuvered regarding Michael toward the registered governmental representative toward me, and I witnessed something throughout his posterior positioning commence transformation. The preliminary trembling of someone comprehending the architectural structure he'd imagined, positioned underneath him, had converted into something entirely different from his ideation. Catherine, what's materializing? I navigated toward my sitting positioning throughout my eating surface head and positioned myself down, the technique I'd discovered implementing inside Michael's workplace, composed, deliberate, someone completely maintaining themselves. Toward Mr. and Mrs. specific individuals, Michael articulated, targeting his discourse toward David and Margaret equally, representing my client Catherine Marshall, to officially communicate that this specific dwelling has undergone juridical safeguarding, opposing unauthorized property transfer, lending arrangement, or encumbrance utilization. Whatever documentation necessitating her authentication toward comparable objectives represents nullified presently, and whatever potential effort toward modifying ownership condition will necessitate autonomous juridical evaluation and her authenticated uncompelled approval. The registered governmental representative proceeded forward and positioned documentation, positioned throughout the eating surface alongside David's portfolio I'd been requested to authenticate, one gathering symbolizing the existence they'd orchestrated, the opposite quietly dismantling it. Margaret's anterior positioning had converted alabaster, her previous environment entirely eliminated and substituted with something more frigid, sharper. The computation she'd customarily maintained concealed, now absolutely externalized. This constitutes ludicrous, she articulated. This constitutes our familiar community's dwelling. Jonathan maintains whatever permissions allocated underneath legislation and underneath whatever reciprocal settlement Catherine willingly and genuinely recognizes, Michael articulated with equivalent constant neutrality. Neither appropriately implements currently. Afterward he displaced himself interior toward his juridical container and positioned out, progressively and deliberately, verification I'd invested dual temporal cycles obtaining via complete quietude. Printed transcriptions of Edmund's surveillance, footage page 14 circumscribed inside chromatic marker, photogra. FIC documentation regarding electronic communications among Margaret and mortgage personnel she'd engaged without my participation. And lastly, something resembling equipment, which Michael utilized for activation, completing my residence's primary space with vocalization originating from David himself. Warm and hesitant, articulating terminology he'd envisioned no individual would encounter replayed throughout this precise positioning. Subsequent to everything's transferred, you fundamentally won't even require examining any of this anymore. David's anterior region underwent complete pigmentation elimination. Margaret remained absolutely immobilized, observing the recording apparatus as something resembling entity that had completely betrayed her personally. What temporal duration have you been comprehending? David requested, his articulation substantially quieter currently, removed from previous confidence, something resembling vulnerable. I examined him, genuinely examined him, requesting one concluding opportunity to encounter something from the being I'd invested matrimonial existence alongside. This individual who'd maintained my appendage throughout my maternal creator's existence conclusion. This individual I'd positioned everything within. Just I recognized what those terminology genuinely indicated, that confession offered by someone convinced of his proximity toward triumph to the magnitude he'd eliminated requirement for protection. Sufficiently, I articulated. The terminology remained throughout the environment, straightforward last. And I perceived something throughout David's expression lastly fracture. Not astonishment, not precisely indignation, merely the progressive comprehension of someone who'd invested temporal cycles certifying regarding his independent triumph, who'd completely disregarded throughout the process that the female seated through the eating surface might undergo comparable examination regarding him as he'd been performing regarding her. Throughout extended temporal intervals, no participant inside the eating surface maneuvered. The illuminating flames persisted deteriorating, beverage continuing remaining partially consumed throughout our finest china. And underneath everything's destruction, I experienced something I hadn't anticipated experiencing currently. Not comprehensive triumph, precisely, yet something approximating quiet, resolved confidence that regardless of what materialized following that evening, I would undergo it positioned upon architectural components that ultimately remained, undeniably and thoroughly, legitimately my own. Within the hour subsequent, they departed. David transported containing suitcases throughout approaching quietness, maneuvering via the sleeping quarters we'd distributed for barely 2 temporal cycles, utilizing that particular kind of constrained, deliberate bodily displacement that someone implementing efforts at protection of some ultimate portion of their self-respect would present. Margaret positioned herself inside my entrance's threshold, refusing ocular contact with me. Although merely prior to traversing exterior, she rotated and transmitted something via articulation emptied of previous environmental warmth. You'll undergo regret. Community constitutes community. You'll encounter that the difficult path, positioned within this dwelling by yourself. I currently possess community, I articulated. Community my creator manufactured toward me. That dwelling represents what he transmitted me, something I'm prepared tolerating with individuals who'd been legitimately securing me versus anybody else. She transmitted nothing subsequently. My entrance underwent closure following them both, and the noise of its calm, last, completely ordinary seemed somehow substantially more perceptible compared to something transpiring throughout the complete evening. I positioned myself inside my residence's front vestibule, permanently following their departure, permitting temporal intervals to elapse, while I maneuvered toward individual compartments, the technique I might be navigating via something I was visualizing for the inaugural temporal instance, although nothing regarding it underwent physiological transformation. The identical wooden components my creator would possess run his appendage throughout, appreciating its construction. The equivalent kitchen opening that caught morning's illumination, precisely the technique I'd conceptualized examining preliminary residence promotional material. The equivalent family region, where minuscule concealed residential apparatus, positioned behind literary materials, had communicated authenticity whenever everybody else inside that location desired it dismissed. It didn't experience as though the dwelling underwent metamorphosis. It experienced as though I ultimately comprehended what had consistently remained genuine regarding it, what I'd never completely appreciate. Prior to that communication, prior to that video, prior to I comprehended genuinely precisely what I capable of whenever something I treasured underwent threat. I initiated Thomas Reed's contact the subsequent morning, predominantly expressing appreciation, yet I imagine what I genuinely desired constituted merely experiencing a kind articulation, subsequent to everything. He maintained quietude momentarily subsequent to I communicated the progression, and afterwards, he communicated something I've maintained throughout me subsequently. Domiciles maintain authenticity, extended compared to individuals do, Ms. Marshall. I'm merely gratified this particular location possessed somewhat authenticity, continuing permitting me presenting toward you. I contemplate regarding that regularly currently. Throughout the temporal cycles that adopted it, contemplating approximately how approaching I existed toward liquidating everything my creator invested his complete existence producing through me, merely because I positioned confidence toward a misrepresented smile throughout an incorrect eating surface. I contemplate regarding how authentic fondness, genuine fondness, doesn't necessitate defensive measures transmitted via discrete documentation, via authorization paperwork transmitted quietly previous someone who positions confidence toward you beyond examining small typography. I contemplate regarding how the genuinely veritable collaboration undertakes construction visibly, not positioned behind maternal figures, deliberately organized decorative references, or a spouse's educated assurances. I continue inhabiting this dwelling. I've subsequently positioned the vegetation collection I'd continuously envisioned, and certain mornings, I position myself positioned throughout my residence's exterior margin with my morning beverage and examine illumination traverse across my property, and I contemplate regarding how facile I could have mislaid everything currently. not merely the architectural components and apertures, yet the quiet legitimately attained tranquility regarding lastly positioning complete confidence inside my personal perspective previous anybody else's expressions. Whenever you'd survived my positioning, I wonder what you would have executed differently or similarly. I genuinely appreciate encountering your reflections inside my response section underneath, and acquiring familiarity regarding your geographic positioning observing this evening. We possess substantially supplementary narratives resembling this specific one toward communicate toward you, so I genuinely appreciate you registering so you never experience a situation approximating this particular one. I appreciate you remaining alongside me via completion. We persevere traversing this journey in collaborative fashion.